So you've probably heard of Dan Brown, who claimed in his book, The Vinci Code, that the Catholic Church at the Council of Nicaea in the year 325 created the canon of the Bible, which books belong to the Bible. You've often heard this repeated claim made not only by him in the Da Vinci Code, but really numerous others since then have stated similar things. Now, most of us know that this is simply not true. But did you know there actually are some early church figures who claim that the Council of Nicaea did have some type of involvement in determining which books belong to the Bible, which books are canonical? That's the conversation we're going to have today right here in my office chats on Reason and Theology. You've likely heard of St. Jerome before, very famous theologian and early church father in Catholicism. One of the reasons why is because he is the one who was commissioned by Pope Damasus around the end of the 4th century to create the Latin Vulgate, the Latin translation of the Bible that's been in use by the Catholic Church for over 1,500 years. So yeah, he's a big deal. Now, St. Jerome, believe it or not, actually was under the impression that the Council of Nicaea in the year 325, the first ecumenical council, this worldwide, universally authoritative council, had some kind of role in determining which books belong to the Bible, which books are canonical. In his preface to the book of Judith, he says this: "But since the Nicene Council is considered to have counted this book among the number of sacred scriptures, I have acquiesced to your request," or should I say demand. So he translates this book and puts it into the Vulgate because Pope Damasus required him to do it, not because Jerome believed it was part of the Bible. But he says, you know what, Nicaea believed that this was scripture, so I'll go ahead and play along and do it. So the way this reads is he seems to have been under the impression that they determined which books belong to the Bible and which books don't. But the matter is actually a little bit more complex than that. Scholars have noted that when Jerome says this, he's saying that Nicaea determined the book was scripture. And by the way, he doesn't say anything about the other books in this particular context. He's just talking about the book of Judith. But saying it's part of scripture doesn't necessarily mean it's part of the biblical canon. You know, there's some early church fathers who make a distinction, unlike people today who think that, hey, if it's scripture, if it's revealed by God, it's going to belong to the Bible. But that wasn't how everybody used to think. Some people thought that you could have something that was scripture, divinely revealed, and yet not part of the Bible. Others thought that you could have something read in the church among a liturgical canon that wasn't necessarily divinely revealed or even part of the biblical canon. So they often had categories and concepts that don't necessarily map onto how we conceive of these questions today. Be that as it may, perhaps he did think that the Council of Nicaea had some kind of involvement in determining which books do and don't belong to the Bible. Maybe he thought that, but we know for sure he was mistaken if that was his position. How do we know that? Well, Pope Damasus, the very one who commissioned Jerome to translate the Vulgate, is the very one who creates a list in the year 382, giving us which books belong to the Bible, the very books that you can find in Catholic Bibles today. Now, there would be no need for Pope Damasus to do that in the year 382, if in 325 Nicaea had already committed some kind of authoritative judgment on the matter. But not only that, his decision was for Rome. Other local cities also created their canonical texts. Just a few decades after Damasus, you have Hippo and Carthage and other places determining what their canon was. And they do line up with Damasus' canon. But that was not universal in nature. There are plenty of church fathers after these 4th century and 5th century councils that had different canonical lists. So the question of the biblical canon was still, to one degree or another, disputed and debated. For example, you can see John of Damascus, usually considered the last church father, holding to certain books in the New Testament that nobody considers part of the New Testament today. And so even in his day, as late as his day, in the 700s, he sees certain books as canonical that are not canonical today, and they don't comport with the previous decision of Damasus, which tells us that those councils did not necessarily receive universal acceptance in the early church. But our story doesn't end there. In fact, it brings us to the most interesting part of the claim that Nicaea had some kind of involvement in determining which books belonged to the biblical text, the biblical canon. This brings us to the Synodicon Vetus. This is a 9th century Greek document that purports to be a compilation and a summary of all the councils that had taken place prior to the writing of this document. And that would include the Council of Nicaea. Now, the document is fascinating because it does say that Nicaea determined which books belong in the Bible. And by way of a miracle, here's what it says. The council made manifest the canonical and apocryphal books in the following manner. Placing them by the side of the divine table in the house of God, they prayed, entreating the Lord that the divinely inspired books might be found upon the table, and the spurious ones underneath. And so it happened. So they basically prayed to God and said, okay, the ones that are going to be considered canonical and part of the Bible, have those come to the top, and the books that are spurious and not true, have those go to the bottom. And so it happened miraculously there. God determined which books belong to the Bible right there at the Council of Nicaea. Now, scholars note that this document is absolutely legendary and has no historical basis, and in fact, again, goes against what we do know historically. Once again, you wouldn't have other synods making canonical decisions about which books belong to the Bible. You wouldn't have those taking place after the Council of Nicaea if Nicaea had made some kind of universally authoritative decision on the biblical canon. And yet there are many synods after Nicaea doing just that, struggling with the question of which books belong to the Bible. So this story is clearly legendary and has no historical basis or basis in reality. So oddly enough, even though Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code is false, it's not true in its claim, curiously, there are some historical figures that make the claim that Nicaea had something to do with the biblical canon, but it's just simply not true. You don't have a decision made in the Catholic Church for the biblical text that's on a universal level until maybe as late as the Council of Florence, certainly by the time of the Council of Trent. In the Eastern Orthodox churches, there hasn't necessarily been a universal synod that has determined which books belong to the Bible, although you can find some Eastern Orthodox arguing to the contrary, but technically you can still see Orthodox still debating the question of the canon to this day. And of course, in Protestantism, the matter's open. You might find some Protestants who hold to the deuterocanonical books of the Old Testament that Catholics and some Eastern Orthodox have, and you might find others who absolutely reject it, following in the footsteps of Martin Luther and the magisterial reformers. If you want to see more videos like this, put your thoughts there in the comment section and let me hear your feedback and let me know if you want to see more. And of course, make sure to hit the like button and the subscribe button. We'll see you next time.